Hey, so the sub should have passed this all out to you. You should have a sheet in front of you that says Unit 4, Graphing Trigonometric Functions, Learning Targets. So like I was telling you on Friday, you guys knowing all of the learning targets straight out at the beginning of the unit is helpful. So I want you to go ahead and read through this, even if a lot of those words don't look like words that you will know them soon. So right now, the goal today is we want you to be able to graph sine and cosine with change in amplitude, graph sine and cosine with change in midline, graph sine and cosine with change in period, and graph sine and cosine with changes of all of those in one function. So what I would love for you to do is to go through and kind of fill in where you are with this. So right now, you're probably, just starting. So we'll be right here. Oh, sorry, the cat just jumped on me. It startled me. We're just starting in all these guys. And then at the end of the lesson, or maybe if you'd prefer at the end of doing your homework, you're going to go through and rate yourself on how you feel you're understanding whatever that specific learning target is. Now, if you notice, some of those have stars next to them, and some of them just have plain old bullets. The stars are not just because I was feeling cute, even though they are. Anything with a star is this is what I really, 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 really want for you to get out of this unit. The other stuff is I'd really like you to know it before you leave, but this is the essential to know before you leave me. So, anything with a star next to it is something you want to know that you understand really well before that quiz and test. In going with things that I have learned, revision of assessment is one of the best ways for you guys to learn. So going off of that, I would love for you to go back and revise your work. So today I'll be grading your tests, and then after we get your tests graded, you are going to be filling something like this out, if you would like to. So this form, there's a big old form, and it said that it should be completed at school, and then you're going to do it with your original test in hand, and I would love for you to be able to do it within 1 week. If that's not possible, we need to go ahead and get together and figure out a time for you to come in, but it's not just at the end of the semester, then we decide, oh, wouldn't it be nice to get some points back? So you need to go through and do correct each problem, and then give an explanation of what you actually did wrong, not just like I skipped it or like I didn't know what I was doing. Well, yeah, but what should you have done to have done that correctly? So there's a few things that are changing in class, that guy and that guy. All right, so let's go ahead and get started on our next unit, graphing trigonometric functions. Now, there's a whole lot of new vocabulary, so you might need to pause me to write all this down. I totally understand. So the first vocab word that you need to know is sinusoid. So you might hear sinusoidal, sinusoid, something like that. That's just a sine or a cosine function. So don't be afraid of it. It's all the transformations and all of that of a sine or a cosine function. Speaking of transformations of a function, it's what it happens to its graph. Does it get stretched or compressed vertically, horizontally? Does it get shifted up, right, down, left, all those different options? Did it get reflected? All of those sorts of things. So we'll be talking about how these graphs are being transformed. Now, some of these words we have specifically for trig functions. So we have something called a midline. A midline is the horizontal line that's passing through the center of the curve. And that's going to be responsible for the vertical shift of the graph. And the equation of it is going to be y equals d. And you'll see what I mean by d here in a few minutes. Amplitude. The amplitude of a sine function is going to be the distance between the minimum or the maximum point and the midline. When the amplitude changes, that's responsible for the vertical stretch or compression of that sine or cosine curve. And the amplitude is going to be the absolute value of the A value. And like I said, I'll let you know what the A value is here in a little bit. The period is the distance horizontally for the sine or cosine to go through one full cycle. So when the period changes, that's responsible for the horizontal stretch or compression. And the formula to find the new period, if it's being transformed, is to take 2 pi and divide it by the absolute value of b. Now, for us, we will never have a negative b value, so we don't have to worry about it being absolute value. But as you're going through your notes, at least in this front section with all the information in it, I want it to have absolute value if you ever have to look back at these for another class. Last thing we have to know is phase shift. Phase shift we're not going to look at until tomorrow, but it's the horizontal shift. It's just a tricky word for horizontal shift. It is always inside of parentheses with that x or theta value. And it's going to be the opposite of c over your absolute value of b, or just plain old b. So first, let's go ahead and talk about graphing sine real quick. So remember, we graphed sine with spaghetti last Friday, and what we found was that when we graphed, we started at the midline at 0, and then at pi over 2, we were at a maximum, and then at pi, we were back at the midline. And then at 3 pi over 2, we were at a minimum. And then at 2 pi, we were back at the midline. And if you notice, we can just go ahead and finish off with this pattern. So if I was at a minimum and the midline, now at 5 pi over 2, I would be at a maximum. And then over here at negative pi over 2, if I was at a maximum and in the midline, at pi over 2, I would be at a minimum. So I'll just go ahead. Oopsies. Let's try this. There we go. Let's do each piece bit by bit. There we go. So if you notice, I was able to go through one full cycle from here to here. That one full cycle. From here to here. That is one period. And its distance is going to be 2 pi. Then if you remember, that maximum value that we got up to was 1, and the minimum value that we got down to was -1. So if you notice, the distance between the maximum value and this line down the center is 1. That's our amplitude. Our amplitude is going to be equal to 1. Oopsies. All right. Now, that line that they are that the amplitude is going up to, that line that passes right through the center, that's the midline. And in this case, it's going to be y equals 0. Alright, so if you notice there, my A value in front of just plain old sine, there's no number in front of sine, so that's just a 1. So as you can see right here, my amplitude was 1. My B value in sine of theta, well, there's no number in front of theta, so my B value is 1. So that means if I take 2 pi over 1, or 2 pi over B, the period will be 2 pi. C was 0, so we didn't get shifted up or down at all. And D was 0, so we didn't get shifted up or down at all. Now let's look at cosine. So with cosine, remember, we started graphing it. It started off at a maximum value. Then it went to the midline. Then it was at a minimum value. Then it was back to the midline. Then it had a maximum value. And then you can finish off the pattern on either side to find out where that next point would lie. And then we'll go ahead and we'll graph our cosine curve. Beautiful. All right. So, if you notice, cosine makes one full cycle between 0 and 2 pi. So that distance to make one full cycle is 1 period. And remember, a period, this distance is going to be 2 pi. Then you might notice here, the distance between that midline and a maximum was 1. And the midline and the minimum was 1. And that's our amplitude of 1. That line passing right down the center is our midline. And that's at y equals 0. So, what do we do? How do we start to graph these functions when there are different transformations that start to happen? Well, let me go ahead and show you. So, let's start with this one. We want to graph one period. So, I'm going to graph 4 cosine of theta. So, my amplitude is my A value, or the absolute value of my A value. My A value here is 4, so my amplitude is going to be 4. The period, I have to take 2 pi and divide it by my B value. So my B value here is 1, so that means that 2 pi is going to have to be my period. Now, to find out the intervals where these major points happen of being at the midline or having a maximum or a minimum, you have to take we find the interval by taking the period and dividing by 4. So, right now, we have 2 pi, and we're going to divide that by 4. And that means that our interval for these major things to happen is going to be pi over 2. And pi over 2 is usually how I label my x-axis. That's going to help me label my x-axis here in just a few minutes. Alright, then we have our midline. Our midline is going to be the number that's added on at the end. Since I don't have anything added on, that's just going to be a 0. Phase shift is always going to be inside of parentheses. And also, phase shift, we're not even going to touch until tomorrow. So for all of today, it's going to be in parentheses, or it's going to be 0. But usually you're going to find it in parentheses. So here we go. we know we're going to start off at 0, 0. And then the interval thing says that for each new interval, I need to add pi over 2. So 0 plus pi over 2 is pi over 2. Pi over 2 plus pi over 2 is 2 pi over 2, or just plain old pi. 2 pi over 2 plus 1 pi over 2 is 3 pi over 2. 3 pi over 2 plus pi over 2 is 4 pi over 2, or 2 pi. So that will give me the distance to, or that will give me 1 period. So now our midline is going to be at 0. Now, since I'm not shifting up or down, it's not that big of a deal to graph it out. But I'm just trying to get you into the habit. There is a midline right there at y equals 0. Now, because of my amplitude, instead of only going up to 1, this time I'm going up to 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So my maximums will be at 4, and my minimums will be at negative 4. 1, 2, 3, negative 4. All right, so now we'll go ahead and we'll graph cosine. Remember, cosine starts at a maximum, then it goes to the midline, then it goes to a minimum, then we're back at the midline, then we have a maximum. And then we'll just go ahead and make our little curves on through. And there is 1 period of that cosine function. Woohoo! Let's look at another. So now we are going to change both the amplitude and the midline in this one. So my A value is 2, so the absolute value of 2 is 2. So that's my amplitude. My period is going to be 2 pi over my B value, which is 1. So the period is just going to be 2 pi. Remember, we find the interval that these major points happen at by taking the period and dividing it by 4. So our period right now is 2 pi. We'll divide that by 4. And that means our interval, again, will be pi over 2, just like the last problem. Remember, the midline, or the D value, is the one that's going to be added on there to the end. So negative 2 is there on the end. Whoops, I should probably put y equals negative 2, because it's a line, and so I should have an equation of a line. Y equals negative 2. And I don't have any parentheses, so I don't have a phase shift. All right, so here we go. Let's go ahead and label up our x-axis. So we know right here that we have positive pi over 2. Pi over 2 plus pi over 2 is pi. Pi plus pi over 2 is 3 pi over 2. 3 pi over 2 plus pi over 2 is 2 pi. And now we know our midline is actually going to be down here at negative 2. So through negative 2, I like to put a little dotted line to make sure I know where those points in the middle are supposed to go. All right, now my amplitude is 2, so that means that my maximums will be up here at 0, and my minimums will be down here at negative 4. Now, since I'm graphing sine, sine always starts at the midline. So I'll go from the midline up to the maximum, back to the midline, to a minimum, back to the midline. Then we'll go ahead and sketch out that curve. Beautiful. All right. So now you might be noticing there's a negative in front of this guy. Oh no. Don't worry. That just means that we're going to have a reflection. Now, something you need to know is that the functions get reflected and then shifted up and down. So we don't have to shift it and then reflect it over the x-axis. It's just going to, we're just going to shift it and then in that little spot where we are, reflect it over. So we don't have to start, reflecting it, shifting up and down, then reflecting over the x-axis. The midline will be where we say it is. So right now our amplitude, the absolute value of that -3 is going to be 3 for this function. The period, we're going to take 2 pi and divide it by our b value. So the period is just going to be plain old 2 pi. So 2 pi divided by 1 is 2 pi. And remember to find the interval. We take our period and divide it by 4. So just like in the last two, 2 pi divided by 4 gives me pi over 2 for the interval. My midline is going to be the line that passes through the middle. It's the guy that's added onto the end. So that's going to be y equals 2, since that's what's added onto the end. And just like for the rest of the day, our phase shift is going to be at 0. So let's go through and label this up just like before. We got pi 0. 0 plus pi over 2 is pi over 2. Pi over 2 plus pi over 2 is pi. Pi plus pi over 2 is 3 pi over 2. 3 pi over 2 plus pi over 2 is 2 pi. Now this time our midline is going to be at positive 2. So here's positive 2. And I like to put my little dotted line through there. Good deal. All right. And now since my amplitude is 3, that means I'm going to go 3 units up from the midline is where my maximums will be. So that will be at 5. 3 units down from my midline is where my minimums will be. So that will be at -1. So now we'll go through and graph. Cosine always starts at a maximum, but it gets reflected over. So instead of starting at a maximum, now I'll be starting at a minimum. Then I'll be at a midline. Then I'll be at a maximum. Then I'll be at a midline. Then I'll be at a minimum. And then we'll just go ahead and sketch our curve. Oops. There we go. Alright, so let's go ahead and change that period a little bit now. So our amplitude is that A value. In this case, it's 2. The period, this time our B value is 2. So 2 pi divided by 2, that period is going to be pi. So this time our interval is going to be different. Our interval, we take our period, which in this case is pi, and we divide that by 4. So we are going to be skipping by pi over 4 this time. The midline is the number that's added onto the end. So there's nothing there, so our midline is going to be y equals 0. And we don't have a phase shift today. So here we go. I'll take 0 plus pi over 4 is pi over 4. Pi over 4 plus pi over 4 is pi over 2. Pi over 2 plus pi over 4 is 3 pi over 4. And 3 pi over 4 plus pi over 4 is pi. So if you notice, we got real squished together right there. Alright, my midline is still at 0. So I'll have that go right through the center there. And that'll be y equals 0 for my midline. All right, my amplitude is 2, so that means my maximums happen up here at positive 2, and my minimums happen down here at negative 2. I'm graphing out sine, so I start at the midline, then I am at the maximum, then I'm at a midline, then I'm at a minimum, then I'm back at the midline. So you just got squished together in there. All right. Now we've got everything thrown into 1. So our amplitude right here is 3. If you notice, that b value is actually 1/2. So when we take 2 pi divided by 1/2, that's the same thing as taking 2 pi over 1 times 2 over 1. So that will give us a period of 2 pi. To find that interval, remember we take our period, which in this case is 4 pi, and divide it by 4. So we'll end up with pi for our interval. The midline is the guy added on to the end, and 4 is added on to the end. So our midline will be y equals 4. We don't have phase shift today, so that's 0. So we're going to start off, we have 0, and then we will add pi to it, so then we'll get pi. And then we'll add pi to it again, and then we'll get 2 pi. And then we'll add pi again, and we'll get 3 pi. And then we'll add pi again, and we'll get 4 pi. So this time I get really stretched out. All right. My midline is going to be up at 4. So I have a dotted line up here at y equals 4. All right. And then since our amplitude is, whoopsies, 3, that means that, oh, I gotta move that guy up. My maximums will be up at 7. So 4, 5, 6, there's 7. And then, oh no, I did not graph that at 4, I graphed that at 3. Let's try that again. Peanut, move. Sorry. Let's move. I wonder, can I just take these and shift you down? There we go. I'll just move these so now they belong where they're supposed to. Let's see, up 3 from 4 is right there. Cool. There we go, set. All right, so, and then 3 units down from 4 is going to be 1. That's where all my minimums are going to be. All right, so since I am graphing cosine, that starts at a maximum. Then I'm at my midline at pi. Then I'm at a minimum at 2 pi. Then I'm at the midline at 3 pi. Then I'm back to a maximum at 4 pi. So my graph just gets real big and stretched out. Awesome. So now what I would love for you to do is go ahead and look back at that learning targets. Now that we've finished our lesson, we can go back and say, yeah, change in amplitude, I got it. I'm going to fill in all of that. Change in midline, I'm set. Change in period, maybe that only kind of makes sense. So, and then at the very end of that, maybe you're like, well, all of them together, maybe I'm just getting there. Or maybe I'm lower than that. Maybe I need a little bit more practice, or maybe all of it makes sense and you're good to go. So go ahead and look at those learning targets and assess yourself. How are you feeling? And if you'd like to wait until after your homework, I understand that too. So I'll see you tomorrow when we knock out phase shift. See you then.